Hello, this is the RPG Crawler, and welcome to another shelf of many things, where I take a look at independent and small press tabletop role-playing games and accessories. This time, I'm going to examine Ankur, Kingdom of the Gods, a role-playing game by Chris Miller, published under the Chris Miller Games label, who was kind enough to send me this copy for review purposes. Ankur, Kingdom of the Gods is one of those custom role-playing games whose system and setting are intertwined to the point where the core book serves not only as a rulebook, but as a campaign setting introduction. I find this one's genre a little hard to place between the particular elements that it focuses upon. There's part sci-fi, part speculative fiction, and part science fantasy. It is set on Earth in the distant, prehistoric past. Now, I'm not going to sugarcoat it for you. If the words Ancient Aliens, Eric von Daniken, or Nibiru make you cringe, you're probably going to want to look elsewhere. However, if you're interested in such things, or at the very least believe that they'd make an interesting background for a Sword and Planet style adventure, then listen on, because Ankur, Kingdom of the Gods is basically Ancient Aliens, the RPG. The premise of this game is that millennia in the past, a fledgling Earth had a catastrophic encounter with a rogue planet called Nibiru that cross-populated the two planets with the seeds of life and sent the latter on an orbit that causes it to approach every 3,600 years or so. Set some 25,000 years in the past, shortly after the Great Flood, Ankur, Kingdom of the Gods has the players portraying characters from one of 5 genetically engineered humanoid species on Earth, or Ki as the game is calling it, going about their daily adventures in the Bronze Age civilization that is under the thumb of aliens from the planet Nibiru, who work to extract gold from the Earth in order to create a mystical substance called mana, which they use to sustain the atmosphere of their home planet, as well as to expand their consciousness and do any number of other things. Now, if I haven't lost you yet, this means that from a mechanical perspective, this system has to cover everything from spears to ray guns, and from ox carts to spaceships, and it does so with a system that is class-based, but skill-based rather than level-based, and one which only uses D12s for resolution, and that, at least, is worth looking at. But for now, let's take a look at the technical information. Ankur, Kingdom of the Gods was released in 2017 and is available as a PDF as well as a print-on-demand hardcover and softcover version. For purposes of this review, I will be referencing the softcover version. It is around 330 full-color pages with a basic 2-column format interspersed with tables and color images. The artwork is evocative of the setting, of good quality, and fairly plentiful, putting this book on par with a fair number of larger-scale publishers' works. There are 14 chapters, plus a few pages of maps and a sample character sheet in the back of the book. While the writing is solid and easy to follow, I do have some issues here and there about the editing. Partly from a technical standpoint, there were a few instances of comma misuse above and beyond what one might expect, and more commonly, word misuse. Things like there, some instances where a completely different but similar sounding word was used, and so on and so forth. It seems that whoever was editing this may have relied a little bit too heavily on machine editing and spell check rather than the old-fashioned proofreading. There were also instances where terms were referenced a few times before being defined properly, or where entire swaths of definitions were repeated in consecutive sections. Although a little bit of that is more symptomatic of being too close to the material, I know my own writing sometimes suffers from the same thing. I don't think that the technical writing errors really detract from the presentation at all. It is noticeable, but not so much that it derails the reading or makes things difficult to understand or anything like that. Now, I should note that I haven't actually looked at the errata, which is available online, so it may well have been fixed in the errata. It's just food for thought if there are later editions or editing passes in the future. Now, prior to the first chapter, there is a preface that explains the inspirations behind the game, an introduction that goes over the basic premise, your typical introduction to role-playing games and dice, and then a quick look at some of the elements of the core mechanics. The core mechanic of this game is based on a D12 roll against a target number, and this target number is based on one of the character's stats or aptitudes, or on one of their aptitudes plus one of their skills. The idea is to roll as high as possible without going over the target number. This is done for both checks and saves. While the game doesn't use levels, there is a wound and stamina mechanic that governs both the mental and physical exhaustion of a character, as well as the damage that they take, as well as the character's ability to put forth special effort into a task, since they can expend stamina to increase their odds or to modify certain things. Now, both stamina and wounds are derived from the character's basic aptitude, specifically their toughness aptitude, but more on that later. Chapter 1 covers character creation. Ankur uses a point-based system in which the initial 8 aptitudes are purchased on a 1-to-1 basis. Each character is then allocated a starting number of experience, which may then be used to purchase skills according to the same formula that you use when you level up skills later on. You're also given a flat amount of money to purchase starting equipment. The 8 aptitudes are Brawn, which affects not only carrying and melee damage ability, but also the range for thrown and muscle-powered ranged weapons, which is an interesting idea. Agility, which covers a fair number of skills. Toughness, which forms the character's wounds and stamina, modified by the species size. Perception, which governs little overall by itself, but is critical for the accuracy of attacks. Intellect, which governs how easy it is to advance all skills. Spirit, which governs psionic skills and accounts for spirit stamina. Influence, which governs skills that affect others. And finally, Speed, that tells you how many actions a character can take during a round. This can be either movement, attacks, or other actions, so a high speed can result in far more options for a character during combat. Aptitudes may be limited depending on what species a character takes, and may be modified based on what class or caste a character ends up as. The player may then select personality traits and motivations that help determine what drives their characters forward, as well as certain advantages and disadvantages that modify starting experience, as well as give them certain abilities. There's also a morality system that functions as a rough alignment system. Interestingly enough, each morality setting, be it neutral, righteous, or wicked, also grants an additional ability for that character. Finally, there's a karma system, which characters may use to try to secure certain roles during play. Chapter 2 covers the player species, and each species has a description, which may include special modifiers and abilities, then their size and their longevity. The 5 species are Adamu, which are basically modern humans, the Balu, who are small nocturnal people, the Enkidu, which are basically large hairy humanoids, almost akin to Sasquatch really, the Gurma, who are squat warrior types, the Mahdi, who are intellectual types with elongated skulls. Now, those familiar with the concepts of ancient alien ideas from, the popular culture and such, can probably track the inspirations for each of these. Chapter 3 covers classes or castes. Each caste is largely defined by what skills they have available, although a number also have special restrictions or privileges, as well as possibly access to languages unique to that caste. The skill access is important because one of the premises of the game is that while some simple skills can be learned by basically everyone or by trial and error, advanced skills are taught by use of tutorial computers handed down from the gods, called ME, which each caste guild has access to. That means that only those caste guilds with that particular skill on their ME can teach that skill. It also adds a bit of an in-game concept that a particular guild's ME might be stolen, thus denying new recruits the ability to even learn that skill until that computer is recovered. The castes are the Lagaru, or the healers, the Naru, or the entertainers, the Garadum, or the soldiers, the Irhandi, which are psionicists, the Dubsar, or the scribes, and the Shidim, or the builders. There's also the Barbaru, who are barbarians, which are considered outside of the guild and civilization structures, and yet have a guild-like structure to them all the same, with their own MEs that they've recovered over the years. Chapter 4 discusses each of the individual skills in turn, and there are quite a few of them. They cover everything from basic mobility and weapon skills to advanced weaponry and crafting. Each skill is handled by circles, which are basically the skill ranks a character may learn in that skill, although, like so much in this game, there's an in-game reasoning behind calling them circles, being that's how the skills are taught. You have a teacher, and then a circle of students, and then another circle of students, and so forth. Skills are advanced by spending experience earned during the game, and each is associated with a particular aptitude and may only be used on skills of that particular type. Now, each skill has a description which can include the actions that it grants. a particular ME category which shows who can learn it, associated aptitudes that govern how it's used, and the complexity which tells how difficult it is to learn. There is a huge number of skills in many categories, some of which are combat related, some of which are particular crafting skills, some are psionic skills that can only be used by those with that particular training, and some may involve advanced technology. Chapter 5 is the game setting, which is a reimagining of the solar system, called the Zal system in this game, to include a couple of new planets, including Nibiru, and a brown dwarf by the name of Etu. It includes details on the inhabitants of Nibiru, some of whom have parallels to certain mythological creatures not only from Sumerian mythology but from other areas of the planet, and are presented in a number of related species united in a planetary kingdom. This chapter includes a creation myth that takes some inspiration from Sumerian myths and recasts it as a sort of solar evolution myth, and then there's maps of the major settlements and spaceports that are on the post-flooded Earth. There's also a more in-depth examination of an area called Shinar, which is basically Mesopotamia, and it is included as the default setting area by the book, at least for the adventures that are developed from it. Now, I believe that there are further setting areas planned for future releases. I know that there's an African one that's coming up. I haven't had a chance to look at that material yet. I don't think it's out yet as of this recording, but it will be soon enough. Chapter 6 goes into money and equipment. For simplification purposes, there's only one currency system, using copper shekels, silver mina, and then golden talents. They advance by 60s instead of by 10s, so 60 shekels equals 1 mina, and then 60 mina equals 1 talent. Gems and such fall into generic resource unit styles of accounting, which also works for various trade goods and other goods necessary for crafting. I kinda like the idea since it makes it easy to abstract the basic crafting formula off of a single unit, which I'll touch on during the crafting section. In terms of gear, Ankur uses a slot style system which is not altogether dissimilar from certain video game RPGs. Effectively, a character can handle a certain number of slots, and each piece of gear is worth a range of slots that are based on its size, with tiny items able to fit large numbers into a single slot. Containers generally possess more slots than they cost to equip. I think it's a good way to balance out the actual encumbrance versus just the weight of an item, which can differ wildly even in the real world, as well as to keep track of holding many items without containers, which can also be a pain if you ever think about picking up large number of coins with just your bare hands. Weapons have the normal equipment cost as well as slot stats, but also have an attack type that can determine the damage type that they do, a range of effect, how many hands they take to use, how many resource units they're worth for crafting purposes, various traits such as fragile or lightweight that might determine their usage, as well as finally toughness and wounds. Rather than a range of damage, weapons' toughness is used to determine damage. In events where they hit an unarmored target, they deal their toughness and damage, whereas if they're intercepted by armor, then they subtract the toughness of the armor that they hit before dealing the remainder as damage. It's an interesting way of going about things. If you're talking about the wounds of weapons and armor, that's just how much damage they take in order to break them. Armor likewise has a size, resource units, traits, and toughness or wounds. As stated above, an armor's toughness contributes to the amount of damage reduction that it provides when it is hit. The way that armor is treated in Ankur is that there's a certain number of armor slots, and you can stack up to 2 pieces of armor in each slot. Each one contributes to a total toughness, which is then averaged out over all of the covered slots. If an attack hits, then the number of covered slots is used as a sort of threshold number, below which the attack hits armor, and above which the attack just hits unarmored flesh, if it hits at all. It's a relatively simple way to handle the idea compared to some systems that I've used and seen to keep track of whether certain areas that are struck by a weapon are covered with armor or not. Chapter 7 covers crafting, and the crafting system in Ankur is unified so that while individual skills are used to craft different things, the formula that is used is pretty standardized. Basically, a character acquires a number of resource units that are suitable to what they want to craft, and then the size of what they're crafting will modify how many resource units they need, as well as the overall time that it'll take. It does get a little bit more complex than that, allowing for a certain amount of customization in terms of granting traits and so forth, but the general gist of things is just a single formula that determines how long something will take and how much it'll take to make. Again, I'm rather impressed with how it all comes together without being overly long and involved. Chapter 8 covers vehicles, but it also covers vehicular combat, movement rates, and similar ideas. And again, it's interestingly genericized in terms of a system, since it has to cover everything from primitive vehicles to the various Vimana, which are machines that are used to cover the lands, skies, seas, and space. The combat system is more thoroughly covered in Chapter 9, and while the initial idea of combat in Ankur is very simple, the combat rules discussed are actually quite thorough, covering a lot of special cases such as terrain, charging, high ground, the various sorts of flanking attacks, and so on and so forth. There's even a variety of unarmed combat styles and stances that can be used on top of the standard combat system, the usual dual wielding and grenade-based attacks, and so forth. The chapter concludes with a critical success table and a critical failure table to add a bit of extra chaos to combat. Chapter 10 covers healing and medicine, which mostly involves ordinary medicine and surgeries, although a few advanced techniques are covered. This chapter also covers such things as poisons, diseases, alcohol, and other intoxicating substances, and even radiation sickness where it's applicable. Chapter 11 discusses the religion and spirit world system of the game, which may seem a bit odd since it's theoretically based on a real world, even if a speculative version. Most of the rules here focus on ghosts, actually, which a character can become if they decide they want to stick around after dying. The presumption is that if psionics exists and mana makes one more aware of the spiritual plane, then ghosts can easily be worked in as well, and I actually kind of like the system that they use for ghosts. An entire chapter on nature and survival follows, and that's in Chapter 12, which gives survival rules and so forth. It's important not only because of the effects of primitive exposure to a range of standard Earth environments, but there are a variety of unusual events that one might come into contact as well, as from falling from a great height to dealing with lightning storms or firestorms. There's even a section on dealing with zero gravity, just in case. Chapter 13 is a brief bestiary, which isn't as extensive as I'd like to have seen, but I understand that its page count was an issue here. But it is good enough to present some examples that can be extrapolated to other things. It's a mix of natural creatures, some prehistoric creatures, including those that should have been gone long before even considering a 25,000 year ago setting, and there's a few really strange and monstrous results of genetic experimentation and the like. The final chapter, 14, is the GM's miscellany that is so common amongst RPG books, which basically goes into running the game, developing NPCs, as well as giving guidance on experience awards, long-term play, and adventure building, complete with a smattering of random tables. As for what I think about Ankur, Kingdom of the Gods, I'm going to have to divide this into two parts. The system, and then the setting. As far as the system goes, I think it's a clean, relatively well-balanced system that could actually be used for a number of other settings in a very generic way, since it handles the mechanics of role-playing across a variety of technology levels. I like the fact that it is based on just one die, and the D12 is a nice compromise in terms of overall numerical granularity between a flat D10 or D6 roll and something like a D20 or a D100 system. I was rather impressed with how feature-complete the system was while still being cohesive overall. I know a lot of custom systems tend to simplify things and thus miss a lot of special case scenarios or try to cover every base, but then end up seeming like a bunch of systems that are cobbled together. Ankur manages to cover a lot of bases and make a lot of these special case rules, present while still feeling like they belong to the same system, like they're the same cohesive design, and that's actually surprisingly rare in terms of indie RPGs. As for the setting, well, it's relatively well researched. It manages to capture a Sword and Planet style feel while still harkening back to Earth mythology. I'm not sure if I'm a fan of everything though, and I say that as someone who, and I'm probably going to lose some of my audience here, I say that as someone who's actually kind of a fan of the whole Chariots of the God thing. I understand that the basis for this was supposed to be ancient Mesopotamian myth, and thus there is a lot of wording and terminology that's supposed to be designed to sound like it may have been coming from that era or slightly before that era. And I see in some instances that the writing, in terms of the writing, the author has left themselves room to adapt other Earth mythologies into the same overall genre. But in some instances, that seems a bit of a stretch, especially since they use that whole Sumerian basis for the naming conventions and such. And it makes certain things sound a little bit off when you're referring to things that are obviously taken from other mythological sources. And, I'm not even sure why the setting doesn't click for me, because, as I said, it is well written. And after all, I love fantasy settings, and a lot of those really, really are kind of a stretch and even bordering completely nonsensical. I guess I could say that the setting of Ankur is well written enough to put it into a sort of uncanny valley area for me, where I'm looking at parts of it and it's just close enough to mythology and history to be recognizable, but then something's kind of off about it and it's not lining up in my head. Or maybe it's about the orbital mechanics and the fact that I know a little bit about that, and I'm looking into the reworked solar system going, planets do not work that way. But that's probably just me. Your mileage is probably going to vary from mine on that instance. A lot of people are probably going to not have any problems at all with the setting. The background, as I said, is really well written. It's well thought out. It's just not quite clicking for me. Now the system, on the other hand, I really like it. I mean, I really, really like it. I would like to see that the D12 system in Ankur is adapted to, say, other genres. Overall, it's a good system, and I gotta admit, it is a gorgeous book. I love the art. It really does get you into that feel of the world it's trying to really represent. It does cover that mix of ancient plus advanced technology. You've got some inspirations here. I want to say maybe from like the Stargate series, although that's not named at all, but you can see some of the inspirations behind the artwork in here. Now there is an upcoming expansion, as I mentioned before, that covers Africa. I might have to check that out when it hits and see if it resolves any of my concerns over how other mythologies might be adapted to the setting. But for now, I'm going to call it at that. I will, as usual, put a link to where you can buy Ankur in the description below. This has been the RPG Crawler with Shelf of Many Things, Ankur, Kingdom of the Gods. If you like what you've seen, remember to leave a like, comment if you got any feedback, and subscribe for more RPG content, both tabletop and computer. If you're feeling particularly generous, I do have a Patreon at patreon.com/rpgcrawler that goes towards supporting this channel. Until next time, take care and goodbye.